a word from the ReMembered Lexicon. The word is fear. Fear. Traditional definition. Fear is the emotional and physiological response to perceived danger, threat, uncertainty, loss, pain, or vulnerability. It is an instinctive survival mechanism designed to preserve life by heightening awareness, caution, and protective action. Fear can emerge from immediate external threats or from internal anticipations rooted in memory, imagination, insecurity, or expectation. At its most basic level, fear is not weakness, it is information. It is the nervous system's announcement that something meaningful feels at risk. Yet fear becomes destructive when perception loses proportion, when imagination outruns reality, or when protection evolves into paralysis. What begins as a guardian can become a prison when fear is no longer responding to truth, but governing identity. Fear is therefore both biological and existential, a reaction to danger, but also a confrontation with uncertainty, limitation, mortality, rejection, suffering, and the unknown dimensions of existence itself. Biblical meaning. Biblically, fear carries two radically different dimensions: the fear that enslaves and the fear that awakens. The first is the fear born from separation, distrust, guilt, and spiritual fragmentation. This fear emerged immediately after humanity became conscious of its own nakedness in Genesis. Fear here was not merely terror of punishment, it was the psychological consequence of disconnection from truth, alignment, and inner innocence. Humanity hid because fear entered consciousness through fractured identity. This form of fear distorts perception. It causes people to conceal, control, manipulate, dominate, avoid responsibility, distrust God, and surrender conviction for temporary security. Scripture repeatedly shows how fear weakens discernment and drives people to compromise what they know is right in exchange for what feels safe. The second form is the fear of the Lord, which is not terror, but reverent awareness. It is the recognition of divine order, moral reality, consequence, wisdom, and the weight of truth. This fear does not shrink the soul, it rightly orients it. It humbles arrogance, restrains destructive impulses, and awakens responsibility. Biblically, transformation is not the elimination of fear, but the reordering of it. A person either fears losing comfort, approval, control, and temporary security, or fears living disconnected from truth, purpose, wisdom, and alignment with God. One fear imprisons consciousness, the other refines it. Symbolic meaning. Symbolically, fear represents the threshold guardian of transformation. Every meaningful evolution of consciousness encounters fear because growth requires the death of a previous identity. Fear therefore appears wherever the familiar begins to dissolve and the unknown begins to emerge. Fear symbolizes the tension between preservation and expansion. It is the internal resistance that arises when the self approaches change powerful enough to alter its structure. The ego fears surrender, pride fears exposure, comfort fears disruption, illusion fears truth. The false self fears anything capable of revealing its instability. In this sense, fear often protects not life itself, but the current version of identity. Symbolically, fear is smoke surrounding the doorway of transformation. Many mistake the smoke for evidence they should retreat, when in reality, it often signals proximity to necessary growth. The deepest fears are rarely about external events alone. They are fears of dissolution, fear of insignificance, fear of rejection, fear of power, fear of inadequacy, fear of abandonment, fear of failure, fear of being seen, fear of losing control, fear of death, fear of meaninglessness. Fear reveals attachment. Whatever controls behavior through fear has become psychologically enthroned. Yet fear also reveals destiny. Human beings often fear most intensely the very responsibility, calling, truth, discipline, or transformation capable of liberating them from fragmentation. Thus, fear becomes symbolic evidence of unfinished development. Not all fear should be obeyed. Some fear exists precisely to be confronted. Psychological meaning. Psychologically, fear is both a protective mechanism and a conditioning system. The mind continuously scans for threats to physical survival, emotional stability, identity coherence, social belonging, and internal certainty. When fear is activated, cognition narrows, attention becomes selective. The nervous system prioritizes protection over exploration, survival over creativity, certainty over growth. Fear changes perception before it changes behavior. A fearful mind interprets ambiguity as danger, disagreement as rejection, challenge as incapacity, and vulnerability as risk exposure. Over time, chronic fear reshapes personality itself. Individuals begin organizing their lives around avoidance rather than intentionality. This is where fear becomes psychologically corrosive. Many people do not realize how much of their identity has been constructed as a defensive architecture against fear. Perfectionism to avoid rejection, control to avoid uncertainty, aggression to avoid vulnerability, people-pleasing to avoid abandonment, emotional numbness to avoid pain, procrastination to avoid failure, superiority to avoid inadequacy, isolation to avoid disappointment. Fear frequently disguises itself as logic, caution, busyness, cynicism, skepticism, ambition, or self-protection. The individual often believes they are making rational choices while unconsciously serving unresolved anxieties. Unexamined fear fragments consciousness because it divides the self against reality. Energy becomes consumed maintaining safety structures rather than pursuing meaningful development. Psychological maturity requires learning to distinguish between protective fear and imprisoning fear. Protective fear preserves life. Imprisoning fear prevents life from being fully lived. The absence of fear is not courage. Recklessness also lacks fear. True courage is the capacity to move responsibly in the presence of fear without surrendering one's convictions, values, clarity, or purpose to it. Practical manifestation. Fear manifests daily in subtle forms far beyond visible panic or anxiety. It appears in conversations avoided, truth withheld, boundaries never established, dreams postponed, responsibilities delayed, potential minimized, convictions compromised for approval, addictions used for emotional escape, constant distraction used to silence internal discomfort. Fear governs organizations through control cultures. It governs relationships through manipulation, dishonesty, emotional withdrawal, possessiveness, and dependency. It governs leadership through image management, insecurity, domination, and refusal to admit weakness. It governs individuals through hesitation, disguised as waiting for the right moment. Many lives stagnate not because opportunity is absent, but because fear continually negotiates against necessary action. Fear often creates the very outcomes it seeks to prevent. Fear of rejection creates inauthenticity. Fear of failure prevents preparation and execution. Fear of conflict destroys honest communication. Fear of vulnerability prevents intimacy. Fear of loss creates control that suffocates relationships. Fear of judgment suppresses originality and purpose. The practical task is not to destroy fear, but to develop authority over it. This requires disciplined self-examination, truthful awareness of internal patterns, nervous system regulation, spiritual grounding, voluntary confrontation with discomfort, responsible action. Despite uncertainty, alignment between belief and behavior. Fear loses dominance when reality is faced directly instead of psychologically avoided. Every avoided fear gains symbolic authority over the individual. Every consciously confronted fear restores internal freedom. A mature life is not built by eliminating uncertainty. It is built by becoming internally ordered enough that uncertainty no longer governs decision-making. Ultimately, fear asks every human being the same question. Will you organize your life around protection of the current self or around transformation into the person truth requires you to become? If you like this kind of content as much as we love presenting it to you, like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. ReMembered TV. Blessings.